I don't know about you, but I am dreading this next round of elections. I wish our country could take a sabbatical for a cycle, giving ourselves a chance to breathe and calm down before we find ourselves doing something really crazy or stupid. Actually, I think it's a bit late for that, given what we saw on January 6th, or even this past week, when Nancy Pelosi's husband was attacked in his home. Politicians and their parties have long used fear and anxiety to get people to support and vote for them, with promises to resolve all their worries, economic and social, and to provide protection against the threatening other. This is not new. And unfortunately, it works really well. So it's escalated. And given that these are anxious and fearful times already, the past couple of elections have been cranking up the fear to the point that we are starting to regard our fellow citizens of the opposite parties as monsters and bogeymen, rather than as human beings with different opinions, and with whom, whether we like it or not, share a stake in the health and well-being of our government and our country. Tomorrow night, as you may have guessed, is Halloween, an ancient festival meant to bring us face to face with our fears and our anxieties and the things we dread, to pull up a chair and befriend them, invite them to a party. Halloween has its roots in the ancient Celtic celebration of Samhain, a harvest festival that marked the end of summer and its bounty and the arrival of the long nights and short, cold days of winter. The Celts believed that this was a thin time when the veil between the human world and the one of spirits and ghosts and otherworldly creatures was more penetrable. And in order to counteract their fears and anxieties about the disappearing sun and the growing cold and darkness, the very real threat of food shortage, and the ghosts and creatures that might appear in the night, they lit a great bonfire, shared sweet treats, dressed up in costumes. And at the end of the festival, they took a spark or ember from the sacred community fire back to their own hearths to light a new fire of their own to accompany them for the long, dark time to come. When Christianity arrived, as happened with many of the pagan celebrations, Samhain was woven into All Hallows' Eve, the night before All Souls and All Saints' Days. Now, we might look upon these rituals as a bit superstitious. After all, we know that the sun will return in the spring and that we need not fear ghosts and spirits. Maybe. Be at this church late at night. You might feel differently. But I see the deep wisdom in these ancient folks who knew how to engage their fears, how literally to make light of them without dismissing them as meaningless. For a long, dark cold coupled with a bad harvest or a bout of the plague could destroy a community. People were very aware of how close to the edge they were living. And the wisdom of the Samhain festival was not just that it helped people face their fears, it also brought the community together. It reminded people that they had one another and that it always helps to share snacks. I know that I'm probably romanticizing it, but the message is powerful enough that we keep some of the traditions, even if we don't really understand why. The Buddhist wisdom story that Shodran describes or shared shows how fear works. Fear talks loud and fast, and it gets in our faces and it unnerves us to the point that we react without thinking. Fight, flight, freeze. It puts our entire nervous system on high alert, upping our heart rate and sending adrenaline rushing through our bodies. It is an instinctual response. And as such, it serves a purpose when we are truly in danger. A problem arises when we are made to fear all the time about things we don't need to be afraid of, when our bodies stay in the state of high alert. It's exhausting, physically and emotionally and spiritually. In her book, Atlas of the Heart, Brené Brown writes about fear and its relatives, anxiety, dread, and worry, and how they all get mixed up with each other. She describes anxiety as an escalating loss of control, worst-case thinking, and imagery. Worry as a chain of negative thoughts about bad things that might happen in the future. And dread as a response to the high probability of negative events, whose magnitude increases as the dreaded event draws near. You bring all these things together, and you have what she describes as the Willy Wonka four-letter word tunnel. You may remember that movie with Gene Wilder as the famous candy maker in the adaptation of Roald Dahl's story. He's taking the children down the river of chocolate to his factory, and suddenly it gets very scary, and he says, "There's no earthly way of knowing which direction we are going. There's no knowing where we're rowing or which way the river's flowing. Is it raining? Is it snowing? Is a hurricane a-blowing? Not a speck of light is showing, so the danger must be growing. Are the fires of hell a-glowing? Is the grisly reaper mowing? Yes, the danger must be growing, for the rowers keep on rowing, and they're certainly not showing any signs that they are slowing." And then suddenly, they're safe at the factory. But that pretty much sums it up, doesn't it? The election, the pandemic, the country, the world. While fear, anxiety, dread, and worry can all serve their purposes, they can also be paralyzing and cause us to react in irrational ways to events that haven't happened yet and may not come into being, or that we make much worse in our imaginations. Don't get me wrong, the worst things do happen. And many of us have experienced that firsthand. And sometimes it's even more terrible and heartbreaking than we could ever imagine. Not even fear could prepare us. But as the young warrior learned from fear itself, we might struggle with its loud and fast talking and yelling. We might be convinced to believe what it tells us, but we don't have to do what it says. We can find ways when it gets up in our face and unnerves us to step back, breathe, and learn from fear what it fears. At every workshop or lecture I have attended, and every book and article I have ever read about change and change management, experts say the same thing. Positive change arises from managing anxiety and fear productively. In other words, honoring and understanding fear and anxiety and worry and dread, so as to be motivated to make thoughtful changes. Too much of these, and people get reactive, they get angry, they get avoidant, sometimes violent. But too little, and people become complacent. There's no reason to change. I want to share with you about this amazing conversation I had this week with Coach Justice, a trans Black fitness coach who leads yoga and movement workshops that help people face the fears that get into our bodies because of systemic racism and homophobia and transphobia and other boogeymen we create to deal with differences we don't understand and that we feel threatened by. I'd signed up to attend a workshop he was going to lead at a local yoga studio. That's hard to say, believe it or not. local yoga studio. But it was canceled due to lack of enrollment. Talk about fear, huh? I was so taken with this workshop idea, though, that I asked Coach Justice if he and I could talk about the possibility of him coming here to First Parish. And he and I are working on scheduling something in the month of February. So he's going to come and he's going to lead a workshop with us. More on that when we can settle the details. But in our conversation, I asked him what led him to create such a workshop. And he told me that in pursuing social justice and liberation work, he found that he always had to separate or hold back some part of his identity so as to fit in and not cause fear in others. For example, he had to hold back his queer identity in Black circles and vice versa in queer circles, and both in predominantly white fitness circles. He came to realize that systemic change requires building communities that can hold and honor all the identities we all carry in our bodies. And for him, movement is a vehicle for building these communities. He said so beautifully and simply something I've been struggling to articulate, the connection between justice work and community and belonging. Movement is just one vehicle for building community that can bring forth systemic change by helping us overcome fears and anxieties around difference and identity, around who belongs and who doesn't. As a covenantal community, we pledge to embody community in a lot of ways. We honor and celebrate the spirit of life. We nurture all souls in our search for truth and the sacred. We bear witness through service to justice and peace. We care and are present to one another, and we are good stewards within, among, and beyond First Parish. First Parish is and can be a sanctuary from all those hobgoblins that haunt our spirits, fear and anxiety and dread and worry. But that is not the same thing as being a place to hide from them, to deny them, or to allow them full destructive control over our bodies and minds and spirits. Like the young warrior, we can create space here to talk with our fears, pay attention and understand them without letting them have power over us, because we can be here for one another. We have been here for one another when the worst has truly happened, accompanying each other through the roller coaster that can follow. And like the ancient Celts, we can create rituals of community that help us cultivate resilience in the face of fear and worry and dread and anxiety, all that is unknown. Gathering around warm fires, sharing stories, singing together, sharing snacks. And we can take a spark of that fire we cultivate here back home with us to help us through the unknown of a long, dark, cold season ahead. A reminder, this spark, that this too shall pass, and the sun and the warmth will return, that we need not be defined by our fears and our worries. We can move through them as we allow them to move through us. As Annie Lamott said in the quote I have at the top, the bad voice inside me cried, what if? What if? What if the power stays off or this happens every month? But the gentle voice of the mother, who had cleaned between my toes, said, what is? What is? What is was food and nature, one another, what we have, and what works.